Welcome back to the R.M.Williams Outback podcast. Great to have you here. This is Terry Cowley. I'm the host of the podcast and also the senior associate editor of R.M.Williams Outback magazine. We're very grateful to Ram Trucks for sponsoring this podcast. The Great Artesian Basin is one of the largest groundwater reservoirs in the world, sustaining life wherever its ancient waters come to the surface. It covers 1.7 million square kilometres, representing over 1/5 of the continent. Most of it lies under Queensland, but it extends into New South Wales, South Australia and the Northern Territory, stretching from Cape York to Dubbo and from Coober Pedy to the Simpson Desert. It's estimated to contain 65 million gigalitres, bearing in mind each gigalitre is 1 billion litres. In fact, you could tip all of Australia's surface water into it, add North America's Great Lakes, Africa's Great Lakes and all the world's dams, and still have room for another 20,000 Sydney harbours. Truly amazing. Photojournalist Mandy McKeesick took a deep dive into the Great Artesian Basin, pardon the pun, for the major feature in issue 156 of Outback magazine, and she joins me now. Hello, Mandy.
G'day, Terry. Good to be here.
Thanks for joining me. Mandy, you started your story by introducing us to the character of Robbie Vinicum. Tell us about Robbie and what he does.
Okay, Robbie is a water officer working for the Queensland Basin, and he's one of only a couple of water officers across the whole state that measures and monitors the bores that tap into the Great Artesian Basin. So until recently, Robbie was one of only two fellas that were doing this job. And as he said, we're both over 50, so the government needs to start looking at younger ones. But what he does is he travels across all of outback Queensland, all the areas that are underlain by the Great Artesian Basin, and he goes to each water bore and does pressure tests and water quality tests and all sorts of tests that we need to be able to monitor to understand what's happening with the Great Artesian Basin.
I love the quote that you captured from him. My hierarchy of risk is travel, snakes, and hot water.
Yeah, that's correct. And I did have a bit of a laugh when he first said that as well. The travel part's easy to understand because he can be anywhere from Cape York down to the South Australian, New South Wales border, across east to Claremont, and I think his furthest west bore is in the Simpson Desert. So it does require a lot of travel. And of course, when he's monitoring these artesian bores, which can be over boiling point, he's got to be particularly mindful of that water temperature and carry suitable first aid devices. And the snakes bit had me a little confused why that they were so high on his hierarchy. But particularly where I met him there between Aramac and Ilfracombe on the black soil plains, the snakes live deep down in those water cracks. And as he's testing water and dropping hot water into those cracks, the snakes come out in a bit of a hurry. So it's always something he's got to be wary of.
Mandy, it sounds like some of that equipment he uses is pretty straightforward and simple.
It is. Robbie travels around in his Land Cruiser ute with a canopy on the back that has every imaginable tool available there. He has valves and spanners, but the main thing is this orifice water meter that is quite large, and he describes it as looking a bit like a rocket. And at every bore, he's got to drag this out, attach it to the water bore, and add another array of gauges onto it to do his job.
Maybe if we can wind back a bit, Mandy, and talk about the geology and the history of the GAB. I want to say the GAB. It's such a cool abbreviation, the Great Artesian Basin. Of course, my colleague Ken Eastwood wrote a very natty headline for your story, The Gift of the GAB. So, listener, if you hear us saying GAB, you'll know we're talking about Great Artesian Basin. So the GAB, as we've just named it, began to form in the Jurassic period.
Yeah, that's right. And it formed over the eons in different geological periods, where in the Jurassic you had a lot of erosion off mountain ranges, and that produced a coarser grained sandstone sediment, which was laid down in the lower areas. And then as the climate changed and the eons passed, that actually became flooded as part of our inland sea, and that laid down a whole heap of finer grained sediments like mudstones. And as this happened again and again, it produced this layer cake effect. And the water can move through the porous sandstone, which has quite coarse grains, but it can't move through the siltstone, which has very fine grains. So that's how we can have these wonderful aquifers in the Gab that can travel across thousands of kilometres. They're sandwiched between the siltstones and the mudstones that don't take the water.
So in the Gab, there are 5 regional aquifers stretching across 1,000 kilometres.
Yeah, that's correct. And trying to get your head around the physical geology of the Gab can be quite difficult because it does have the 5 main aquifers, but it's not a simple basin as we're calling it a basin. There are actually sub-basins. So if you can imagine dips and rises and faults and fractures, so the water may enter on the western fall of the Great Divide, but it doesn't follow one particular channel all the way across to the springs in South Australia. It might get sealed up against a fault, or it might sort of roll over a rise and into another basin. And the more work they do on the basin, the more complex it is. And that's why the work that Robbie does is so important, to monitor what is happening so we can get a better understanding of it.
And the water is, of course, not uniform. Temperatures and pressures vary with aquifer depth, salinity, dissolved minerals and pH change.
And it can change so quickly. Like Barcaldine is quite well known for its good quality water, but just a little bit further west at Longreach, the water is undrinkable and has been known as being undrinkable for a long time. Then you move up to Aramac, where I spent a bit of time. The water temperatures there aren't as hot as they might be in Birdsville. That's because they're closer to the edge of the Great Artesian Basin and haven't had that time and pressure to heat up.
We looked into a 2022 Geoscience Australia study. They looked at what was happening in the Great Artesian Basin over 3 years, and they were looking at how we should manage the resource.
And what they concluded was that doing that testing, like we were talking about, that Robbie does, is still the best way of managing it. It's not so much a matter that we might run out of water in the Gab. It is just that huge, it's almost unimaginable. But it's controlling that pressure, and that's some of the problems we've had over the years with too many bores drilled into the Gab. So monitoring the pressure in those bores and what's going on is critical to the future.
So water enters the Gab through recharge zones, mainly on the western fall of the Great Dividing Range.
Yes, it does, and it enters through a couple of different ways. It can be rainfall falling directly on these porous sandstone aquifers, or it can actually leak out of the bottom of streams and rivers. But once it's in there, it moves really slowly. It can be only 1/2 metre a year. So they estimate by the time the water gets to South Australia or can pop out at some of these springs that it's over 1 million years old. So it's fossil water. It's quite fascinating.
So before human intervention, the only clue to the immense water source below the ground was these springs.
Yes, and I suppose the most famous springs, when we think of the springs, are the ones around South Australia. You've got Dalhousie there, which is just a mecca for people that have been travelling across the Simpson Desert and are looking for a lovely warm bath at the end of the trip. It's magnificent. You've got the bubbler down there, and then, as Kirsty McKenzie wrote about in her story in a previous issue of Outback, you've got the Wellness Way all through Queensland, and that's all natural springs and artesian water that's really underpinning a lot of tourism in that state and in New South Wales as well.
We tend to think about this great water resource as how humans interact with it, but there are 13 spring complexes throughout the Gab, and they all contain communities of native species listed as endangered.
Yes, and I was lucky to get up to Eggbaston Station up there north of Aramac, which is now owned by Bush Heritage. And they estimate that is probably the most ecologically diverse spring system in the whole country. I think they have 34 different species there that are actually dependent solely on the artesian water. And when you go up to one of these springs, it doesn't look a great deal. It's shallow water, quite clear, but you'd drive past it or you'd walk past it without a second look. But if you just take that time to sit and you see these tiny, timid little fish, they come sneaking out of the reeds and have a look at you and then dart back in and then come out a bit longer. You'll start seeing the little snails, you'll see back swimmers, you see this great big microcosm of life.
In particular, at Edgbaston, they're concerned about the red-finned blue eye.
The red-fin blue eye was probably the reason that Bush Heritage bought the station in the first place. It was discovered in 1991 on a spring at Edgbaston, and it's the only place in the whole country that it's ever been found. It's Australia's smallest freshwater fish, only tops out there at about 3 centimetres, and it's still only known at that one area that they call the type locality. But the ecologists at Bush Heritage have been able to translocate those redfin blue eye to different springs around the station now.
So, before the colonial explorers went in search of an inland sea, the springs of the Gab supported First Nations people, of course, and you spoke to Arabunna elder Reg Dodd about this.
Yeah, Reg has got a great connection to the springs, not only through Arabunna law, but he's also worked on the cattle station there and is now involved in tourism. So he's got this fascinating connection to the springs through those three different things. And he tells us about the rainbow serpent there hunting at the Babbler, and he was then killed and eaten at nearby Blanche Cup. But the fellow that killed him himself died near Lake Eyre. So all these stories are interwoven. Yeah, and Reg is still running around there showing everybody now about the springs and the importance of them.
Yeah, I mean, the springs would obviously have been an incredible oasis for Aboriginal people.
Yeah, and in a country where it's very dry because the Great Artesian Basin underlies our arid areas. So there isn't much water. So to have these springs, and even today to have those bores, it's a blessing.
So early attempts to sink wells based on the presence of the springs were not terribly successful because of inadequate technology in drilling to the depths needed. But in the second half of the 1800s, it all started to come together, didn't it?
It did. It's really got moving over in North America, in Canada, and the United States, and they started developing the technology to drill deep. So for Australia to get on board involved a lot of importation of that equipment and knowledge. It was a fellow called J. Lowhead, I'm not even sure of his first name, who was contracted to sink a bore on the railway that was being laid between Rockhampton and out west past Barcaldine out Longreach way. He was contracted to try and sink some of these bores and see if he could tap into the Great Artesian Basin.
And the first recorded piercing of the Gab was a shallow bore drilled adjacent to springs on Killara Station near Burke in 1878.
And what I can gather from that yes, they did hit artesian water, but it wasn't very deep, nor did it flow for very long. Artesian water, as by definition, is water that comes up of its own accord. It doesn't require a pump or a windmill or anything such as that to get the water to the surface. It comes up under the pressure. And when Lowhead was drilling, I think he was about 30 kilometres east of where Barkey is now, he tapped the Great Artesian Basin there and they got quite excited about it. But again, that water didn't flow very well. So in the end, they had to put a big windmill on it. And that's the windmill that you do see in the main street of Barkey today. It wasn't till he actually moved to where we know as Barkey and sank a bore that became the Ash Street bore that everyone went crazy. He found water at 210 metres and it flew up into the sky, and even the engineers couldn't turn it off. They described it as the most incredible sight.
Yeah, you can imagine the excitement. Everyone calling it liquid gold. And the Daily Telegraph of the time, this is January 1888, reported under the heading of a subterranean river in Queensland.
Yeah, can you just imagine it though, Terry? Just you're in a place where it's summer for starters, and we're out in Western Queensland, so it's probably 40 degrees plus, and we've gone through a few droughts, and everyone knows how bad they can be. And suddenly this drill rig comes along, and you've got a fountain of water that can't be turned off, and it overflows where they've been drilling. It flows into the nearby lagoon, tops that up, flows on down to the river. It actually gets the river starting to flow. So it just would have been mind-boggling, the change that made to the arid areas of Australia.
Yeah, the Telegraph reported the Ash Street bore as the biggest artesian well in the world, and in a part of Queensland that you've just alluded to, far removed from any watercourse, and where thousands of stock perished in the last drought. And then Barkey adopted the name the City of Artesia.
That's right. Everyone started getting on the artesian bandwagon then, and bores started to be drilled everywhere. And we've got some great stories around some of our bores, such as down at Thargomindah, where in 1893 water was struck at 800 metres, and the town, used that water to create hydropower, and was only the third town in the world behind Paris and London to have street electricity powered by hydroelectricity.
Yeah, it's a great story. Your story, that story I mean, in history was a great story. Your story is a great story too. But in your story, you say by 1898, Thargo was lit up between 5:30 p.m. and 11:30 p.m. Longer if the supervisor could be bribed with rum or card games, of course. And it continued this way until 1951, when the system was replaced by a diesel generator. Now, Banjo Patterson, of course, his finger on the pulse of the Australian bush, captured the excitement of the Artesian age with his poem Song of the Artesian Water, published in 1896. He wrote of the drilling for water during the drought. If the Lord won't send us water, oh, we'll get it from the devil. And of the exuberance when it was found. Do you want to read that part of his poem, Mandy?
I can do that. So he goes, but it's hark, the whistle's blowing with a wild, exultant blast, and the boys are madly cheering, for they've struck the flow at last. And it's rushing up the tubing from 4,000 feet below, till it spouts above the casing in a 1,000,000-gallon flow.
Lovely. Much excitement. So by 1899, Queensland had 524 artesian bores. By 1915, the number rose to 1,500. By 1952, it had 2,300 and another 500 in New South Wales and South Australia, all taps of continuously flowing water spilling into bore drains for distribution across arid lands. Well, I guess with all that, it's no surprise that barely trickling bores became more frequent as more bores were drilled.
Yeah, that's when we started noticing the problems. The pressure started dropping in a lot of the bores that were already drilled. We had problems with the bore drains themselves because they are all open to the air, so it comes out of the bore and just will travel along the top of the surface for kilometres upon kilometres in these bore drains. They would often break out and you'd lose the water somewhere else. They were also a haven for feral pests, whether that be fauna or flora. We had things like prickly acacia would come up around bore drains. Feral pigs, of course, love wallowing in any sort of water, so they love the bore drains. And it seems like this inexhaustible supply of fresh water that we had was suddenly under threat.
And of course, at different times, different governments have tried to address that. And even as recently as 1999, federal and state governments combined to introduce the Great Artesian Basin Sustainability Initiative.
Yes, the GABSI as it was known. And the GABSI became a great success story. And it's a good story for agriculture too, because when you think about it, government paid for half of all these works to happen, and it was dominantly farmers that paid for the other half. And what that involved was closing down old bores that were at risk of casing failure or have ceased to flow, drilling new bores so we could still access the water, but capping those bores so the water wasn't just flowing out madly everywhere. It was only used when it was needed. And the other part of the program was to replace bore drains with piping. So water now comes out of these bores and goes straight into pipes that's then distributed across the country, and the bore drains themselves are no longer required. So it was a great water saving initiative, and we started to notice increases in the pressure across the GAB quite quickly after this work.
So agriculture continues to be the greatest consumer of water from the GAB, estimated to account for 62%. Mining and oil and gas production account for another 30%, with the remainder used by a variety of sectors, including tourism and more than 100 towns. And back in Thargomindah again, They had an innovative solar-powered cooling tower, which was constructed in 2021 to reduce the bore water temperature.
Yes, and another reason was also to reduce the smell. Apparently, Thargomindah, like some of our outback towns, actually smelt like rotten eggs there for a while because of the bore water. So they put in this innovative cooling tower. And if you're walking around Thargomindah, the locals will actually have a bit of a grumble about it and say, oh, it's not that good. And we have to heat up our water now because they've reduced, I think, the water temperature from 72 degrees down to 35. So if you can imagine initially having 72 degrees water coming into your house, you never had to worry about heating up your hot water, but it also had its problems. So reducing it to 35 makes it easier to say water your garden, but now they have to heat up their water to have a shower. So as Tractor Ferguson, the Wooloosshire mayor, says, it does have good and bad points, but he thinks in the long run it'll be the way to go.
Now, BHP's Olympic Dam copper gold uranium mine in South Australia often makes headlines for its water consumption, reported at 33 million litres per day. But coal seam gas producers can use extracted water for irrigation to grow fodder crops, whereas others can't. Can you explain this a bit, Mandy? And you spoke to Dion Stent Smith and his wife Elaine on Shandon Vale Station about this.
I'd like to be able to explain it more, but I think it gets caught up in bureaucracy and red tape that I'm not likely to understand anytime soon, nor is Dion there on Shandonvale. But he feels that because he's got this really good water, because a lot of your artesian water has a salinity too high to make irrigation viable. But up there at Shandondale, they have a low salinity and he could irrigate, but because of regulations, he's not allowed to, which, yeah, it does make you question it. And if Dion can't tell me why, then I don't know why either.
We shouldn't forget about the sheer joy of soaking in warm artesian water, as they do on that station. I'm sure you did it while you were researching this story, Mandy.
I didn't actually do it as much as I would have liked. At Shandondale, they've got this incredible artesian spa that is built on top of a windmill, of all things. So you've got this well constructed staircase to the top of the windmill where there's a great big spa bath and an artesian shower, beautiful warm water, and it overlooks a waterhole. And the reason I didn't jump in that one is because Shandondale is also set up as a tourism business and it's quite exclusive. And that night they had a family there from Boston, Massachusetts. So I figured if they'd come all the way around the world, and I think they had 6 stops in Australia, if that, and Shandon Vale was one of them. So sandwiched between Lizard Island and Sydney, they were out here in this beautiful oasis, and I didn't really think it was fair for me to jump in and wreck their ambience. So I did miss out on soaking at Shandondale, but yes, I did find a place to soak in other parts of the basin.
Very gracious of you not to bomb them, Mandy.
I just took lots of photos of them instead and annoyed them that way.
Fair enough. And they're lovely photos too. They're very inviting, those photos in particular. So throughout 2024, the topic front of mind for all those dependent on the GAB has been mining company Glencore's pilot carbon capture and storage project, which proposed injecting 330,000 tonnes of liquefied carbon dioxide, a byproduct of coal-powered electricity stations, into a GAB aquifer.
Yeah, and when I first heard that story, which was earlier in 24, it's something that actually prompted me to pitch this story to Outback because even I didn't realize how big and how important the GAB was. I think a lot of the time when we hear that word basin, we're thinking the Murray-Darling River Basin, the river system, which is above the surface. And I think we get that confused with the Great Artesian Basin. And obviously, they're two separate things. So I was quite intrigued to learn more about the basin and how big it was. And that all came about because this was in the news about them going to use the basin for carbon capture and how that could potentially, or could it potentially, wreck a lot of what we know as the GAB.
Tell me about this Ag Force case, they took an unusual step of filing court proceedings against Federal Environment Minister Tanya Plibersek.
So in February 2022, Glencore had put through their submission to do the carbon capture, and it had to pass a federal government test to say that it wasn't going to affect anything of national significance. And for reasons that we don't know, that passed straight through. And that's where AgForce have turned around and argued that no, the Great Artesian Basin is of national significance. It goes over 4 states. And it shouldn't have been said that Glencore could just go and do this. So that's their argument, that the GAB is of national significance and we need to protect it on a federal level.
There is still concern that the GAB is still at risk, though.
Yeah, look, the GAB underlies, or 70% of the GAB is in Queensland, which we've talked about before. And the Queensland government, to their credit, have taken all this on board and taken the steps to ban any future carbon capture into the basin, which is just wonderful news for everybody that relies on it. But because the basin does extend into New South Wales and Southern Australia and the Territory, we actually need that regulation to extend over those states as well. And unless we can do that, we're not properly protecting this wonderful groundwater resource.
Okay, so in a sense, maybe this, threat to the GAB has done us all a bit of a favour in really reminding us all about the beauty and the expanse and the incredible usefulness of this amazing water resource.
It has. It's been a real silver lining. It's brought the GAB front in mind to a lot of us, myself included. I didn't understand how wonderful and how widespread it was. And I hope through this story that we can get out there to a lot of other people and all of our readers just how important this is. This is just a world-class resource. We did do it wrong in the past by putting too many bores into it and not look after it properly, but those remediation works are continuing. We continue to cap bores and replace bore drains. So I think it's a great news story of we came in all hell for leather at one stage and had potential to wreck a resource. We recognised that what we were doing was wrong, and we've been able to put in place things that can correct that. So hopefully in the future we can find that balance that's needed in everything, but a balance between the water we need to keep our arid communities going out there and the water that we need to preserve for our springs, for those endangered flora and fauna, and just to preserve the GAB on its own. Because she's a wonderful story.
I love it. Well, we certainly want it to be there for future generations, don't we?
We certainly do.
If you'd like to know more, grab a copy of issue 156 of Outback magazine. Mandy's taken some fantastic photos as well to go with the story, and there's some great diagrams in there. There's a lot more detail. You want to know more, you can read all about it in Outback magazine. Mandy, thanks so much for talking to me today, and I'm sure we'll talk again because you are a regular, very regular contributor. Always love reading your stories, and I'm sure you're already well onto the next one.
I am, but I am enjoying publicising the Great Artesian Basin. Even with this podcast, we'll get it out there further. We'll get the good story out, as we always do with our Outback stories. Thank you, Prue.
So thank you, Mandy, and thank you out there very much for listening, and I will be back with you in the next episode of this Outback podcast. If you've enjoyed it, please tell your family and friends. Catch you next time.